Hi everyone. Today we are going to look at innovations in River Valley governments. And at the top of your notes, it should say, I can examine the advancements in governments in the River Valley civilizations. So let's take a look. All right, well, we want to look first at why were governments created. It was really due to this rapidly growing population, and what they needed were two things: order and safety to keep the civilizations growing. So there were four main purposes of why governments came about. The first one was obviously to protect communities from outside attacks. You don't want to be attacked. You're not going to survive if you are attacked. So to help with protection. To help manage disputes within, so that kind of thing, to maintain peace, and to manage resources like water, use of taxes, use of distribution of food resources. All right, so let's look at the four key components that helped answer those purposes. And this you can just list really quickly. We'll get into detail on each one in a minute. So first is leadership. You need a strong leader. The second is laws. You need to have rules and a general understanding of how people need to act. You need centralized organizations. So how does society work? What can be found where? And lastly, you need social class. Who is in power and how do people kind of help each other? All right, let's first take a look at leadership. So leadership in most of these River Valley civilizations consisted of one ruler. What does that look like? It's a little different in each civilization. The first we're going to look at is Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia had a king, and that king was linked to the gods, and so had some special communication with the gods. So you can put it's ruled by a king, and the well-known king was Hammurabi. We'll talk about him in a future few minutes. In Egypt, we've been talking about, the Egypt had the pharaoh. And pharaohs, again, had some connection to the gods. A well-known pharaoh in Egypt was known as Khufu. He actually built all three of the Great Pyramids. And then lastly, in ancient China, we've got emperors. So the emperor did kind of have a link to gods or the afterlife, and a well-known one is Qin. Even though it's spelled with a Q, it's pronounced Qin. Now, how were all of these leaders supported? They either had support with a religious leaders in their civilization, or other members of like a ruling class, nobles, the wealthy class. So that's where they got their support from. Okay, so that's leadership. All right, let's look at the next characteristic. Actually, it's not the next characteristic. We're just going to talk about how leaders came to power. So they got power from the gods, and this power could either be passed down from a family member, or it could be taken over after a time of fighting within a civilization or from another civilization. Now let's talk about how this might look. We're going to use China as an example. China had dynasties, and a dynasty is a line of rulers from the same family. So if an emperor was in charge, Emperor Qin, and he passed away, then his son would most likely be the next emperor. And if that emperor passed away, then his son might be the next emperor. And if the son passed away, it would go to, it's usually a male, somebody else that they would have designated that would be within the family. Now, this was such a important idea, this dynasty, that there was even this cycle to explain the process. Now, basically, China's dynastic cycle basically said that when a ruler came to power, an emperor came to power, it was because people believed that the gods approved this dynasty. And then the dynasty would get weakened either through conflict or natural disaster, or they were getting too greedy. And then because of those things, the people would believe that they didn't have the gods' approval anymore. And so they would be overthrown, and then a new dynasty would come in, and they would think, oh, because the new dynasty's in, they've got the approval. So that cycle would keep going. And that's how leaders would come to power in China. That's the example of that dynastic cycle. All right, now we're going to move on to the next characteristic. So laws are the next characteristic, and they were really needed just to maintain social order and to keep the peace. Now, one famous example from Mesopotamia is Hammurabi's Code. Again, that King Hammurabi. He's a famous king, and he was known for having one of the first set of written laws. So he had all of these laws written down on a stele, which is just like a pillar, so that everybody could read it, or at least it would be around for everybody to read and be fair. Now, interestingly, not everybody could read, but at least they were written down, so you couldn't change the law depending on what you wanted. For example, if it was cost $1 because, you stole something, whatever the thing was, it would always be $1. They couldn't change the amount, or they couldn't change the punishment. And so the big deal also with Hammurabi's Code was the idea of justice, and the punishment would fit the crime. So you'll oftentimes hear it as an eye for an eye. And actually, one of his laws read that if you accidentally put somebody's eye out, then your eye would be put out. That is the punishment. So that idea of justice, what harm you caused would come to you. And there were 282 of these laws that spoke to fairness and justice. Okay, a centralized organization is another characteristic of government, and this example is a city-state. Basically, this structure is organized so that people can live and work and have, the expectations. They know where to go to buy things and where the government is located, and it just helps their civilization run smoothly. So there would be an area with wealthy and poor homes. There would be an area for shops. There would be an area that housed the ziggurat and the government buildings. And the ziggurat was most often in more like the center and the highest point of a city-state in Mesopotamia. And it basically, you had these walls outside for protection against attack. So you can kind of see where these centralized pieces would come into play. So this city-state is just an example in Mesopotamia of how government helped control what happened and led to efficiency to help civilization run smoothly. All right, lastly, we've got social class. Another name for social class is social hierarchy, and that just meant that people belonged to different social classes, and each class had a rank or a role in society, so they kind of knew what they were supposed to be doing. The more power people had, the more toward the top they were. So if you even look at these, here's Egypt's social class. We've got the pharaoh at the top. China has the emperor at the top. And Mesopotamia has the king at the top, okay? So that most powerful person was at the top. At the bottom, you'll most often see slaves. So slaves in all three, they had the least power. But then also in the middle, it's just that people would know their role. Nobles were rich people, and they were probably not merchants, but they were part of that royal class, and that kind of is in each of these as well. So what I want you to do right now is just fill out that social hierarchy triangle on your notes page you can just put leader at the top and slave at the bottom, and then just look at the middle for all of these and kind of fill in what might go in between the top and the bottom. And that social hierarchy just helped keep society organized. All right, last question is your think about it question. Write a good paragraph to answer this. You want to look at those 4 characteristics and which was the most important for helping civilization to last a long time. Use things that we've talked about from the video, and then you're going to check it in with Mrs. Sims.